This is part two of our series with our friends at the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. There's so much happening in the media today where we hear about various cases where police officers are being indicted criminally simply for doing their job. And there's so much interest in this. So I thought I'd bring on our friend Jason Johnson and another gentleman who this is what he does on a daily basis, who is able to explain some of the intricacies of what happens when a police officer gets indicted. Why does this seem to be on the rise, and why has American law enforcement become so politicized? So Jason Johnson and J. Michael Hannon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sergeant. My pleasure.
So, Jason, I'm going to start with you. Just remind folks about the LELDF and what you guys do and why you're so darn busy these days.
Yeah, thanks, Betsy, for having us back. So the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund is a charitable organization. We've been around for almost 30 years. Actually, in August, we will celebrate our 30-year anniversary. Started by a group of Reagan administration officials, including former Attorney General Edwin Meese, who remains on our board. And our primary mission has been for 30 years to raise funds to support law enforcement officers who have been wrongfully charged with crimes related to their work. And, as you indicated, we're seeing more and more and more of this really since about 2015, and then really picking up pace in about 2020. We're starting to see even irrational prosecutions of law enforcement officers who are merely doing their job, following the rules, certainly following the law, and yet being prosecuted across a wide array of types of incidents, whether they're uses of deadly force or in a particularly egregious case that we're supporting, the former officer, Terence Sutton, who is a former DC Metropolitan Police officer who was prosecuted for murder in a case in which he attempted to stop an individual who was operating a moped, a person he was familiar with, who was a documented gang member, who ultimately, after a couple of minutes of just following him around the blocks in the district, was struck by a civilian vehicle and killed. And in a case that I believe is unprecedented in the United States, a prosecutor brought charges against Terence Sutton and ultimately obtained a conviction for murder in this case. And it's a case that we feel very strongly about. But in addition to that case, we have over 10 officers that we're supporting now, which is well beyond what we've ever had in the past. So the need is great to support our law enforcement officers who have been wrongfully charged. And I'll say one more thing, Betsy, before I conclude this introduction, is that we don't take every case that is that we are approached about. We vet these cases very carefully, and we only want to be involved in cases that truly represent an injustice, and especially those cases in which we believe the charges are brought primarily for political reasons. And I think that if any of your viewers take a look at our website and look at some of these cases, they'll have to agree that these cases really deserve our support and attention.
Well, and you're absolutely right, Jason. That's why organizations like the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund even exist, is this crazy atmosphere that we're in now, where, police officers are being, prosecuted, and in some cases, I believe, persecuted, again, simply for doing their job. That's why the National Police Association exists, just because we need so much support for the American law enforcement officer privately because of this atmosphere where we are just being every day really being demonized and vilified and politicized in this country. Mike, how did you get involved in this?
Well, I was a federal prosecutor for 8 years in the 80s, and I made a lot of great relationships with law enforcement officers all through the federal government because I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., as well as local officers. And when I went into private practice, I made it a point to go out of my way to support law enforcement officers. And I want to thank Jason for his financial support for Officer Sutton. And in addition to that, we're receiving financial support from the National Fraternal Order of Police legal plan. And my message to your law enforcement officers out there is you need to find some financial protection if you find yourself in the crosshairs of the government somewhere. And we're really appreciative of Jason. And I can tell you that I'm not the only lawyer on the case, and Jason has gotten us a really top drawer, outstanding lawyer to help us at this stage in the case.
You know, Mike, you and I started our careers around the same time, right? In the early 80s. And I was a young cop, and we concerned ourselves with things like, would I get disciplined if I broke a policy? Would I maybe get, the big horror for us was, would we be involved in a lawsuit? Now, fast forward 40 some years, and as I travel the country and train police officers and speak at conferences, their number one concern is not, am I going to get hurt? Not, am I even going to get fired? Their concern is, am I going to get criminally indicted and go to prison? How did we get here?
This is the only case, Jason is absolutely right. This is the only case, and this was prosecuted by the Department of Justice, and that's an important issue here. The only case the Department of Justice has ever prosecuted against a law enforcement officer in the country based upon the law enforcement officer's violation of the policy of the Metropolitan Police Department regarding pursuits. There was no other evidence that the government relied upon. And the additionally scary thing about that is that Officer Sutton was the member of the crime suppression team in the District of Columbia. He had been with that team for almost 12 years. And those teams exist all over the country. They are the frontline force to try to protect us from violent drug dealers. And the unit that he was a part of, plus the supervising lieutenant, were attempting to conduct a Terry stop, a classic Terry stop of a known drug dealer who was believed to be armed at that particular point in time.
Explain to people what a Terry stop is, Mike.
Well, if a police officer is working on one of these teams, he's taught, or she is taught, to follow her suspicions. Her suspicions are part of her training, her experience on the street. And her suspicions, many times, as a result of observation, can lead to a reasonable belief that someone may be armed or someone may be committing an offense, and that could even elevate itself to probable cause to conduct an arrest. That's the job that these elite units participate in, and they know exactly what the limits are under the Constitution of what they can do. And in this case, they had plenty of reason to believe that this individual was armed. After he was hit by the civilian vehicle, he was found to have $3,000 in small bills wrapped in cellophane around his legs under his sweatpants. And there were other indicia of drug dealing. He had 10 times the level of marijuana that would take to disorient someone. But the important thing here is that under the Constitution, what these officers did was perfectly lawful. A fleeing individual, even fleeing a traffic stop, is responsible under Supreme Court precedent for his own death, if that's what happened. And this is what these officers have been taught. And so the Department of Justice has turned this on its head. And the answer to your question is yes. The Department of Justice is beginning to use policies of Metropolitan Police Department officers more aggressively in other cases that they have brought. Use of force policies, report writing policies, everything that you can imagine. And the consequence of that is to absolutely paralyze the law enforcement officers in the District of Columbia, to the discredit of the people.
Now, I just want to remind people that, and I talk about Washington, D.C. a lot in the media, the level of crime in Washington, D.C. is extraordinary. And, this is one of the most gun-controlled cities in the country. It's one of the highest crime. Their crimes like drug offenses, shootings, carjackings, especially among juveniles, are just extraordinary. And so the DC Metro Police Department has been doing an extraordinary job of trying to keep up with and suppress some of this crime. So for this officer to be indicted as a member of an elite unit whose job it is to try and keep people safe, I think is particularly egregious. Now, Jason, I want to talk about something a little bit generic in this. We keep hearing in the media that police officers in this country have qualified immunity, and that allows them to do whatever they want without consequences. Clearly, that's not true. Can you explain that to folks?
Well, first of all, I always like to, whenever we talk about qualified immunity as it applies to law enforcement officers, to remind everyone that qualified immunity is not unique to law enforcement officers. It is somewhat unique to government employees generally. There also are many other forms of immunity that are not qualified, that are absolute, such as judicial immunity, prosecutorial immunity, and there are many others. So what police officers and other government employees receive is on a much more limited basis. And essentially, they're given a little bit of leeway when the law in a particular area is not clearly established. So as Mike has mentioned a couple of times, is that police training is extremely important because police are trained to follow the law as it exists at that time. And of course, we know the law changes over time, and there are novel situations that police officers encounter all the time. And oftentimes when they do, there is a compulsion to act. They have to act to protect the public safety. And they don't have, as some professionals have the ability to consult their in-house counsel or their lawyers or research the law or consult their policy. Police officers rarely have the opportunity to do that. They have to act in order to protect the public. And so in areas where the law is not clearly established, they are given a little bit of leeway to make what in hindsight may have been a good faith mistake, perhaps. And so that's what qualified immunity is all about. It is being assailed. It's been under attack for a number of years. There's been efforts to roll it back. It's part of the George Floyd Police Reform Act that didn't pass. And you hear people speak rather ill of qualified immunity as if it's the enemy. But I can tell you that, first of all, qualified immunity is as I described, but also it only represents a minority of the instances in which people act like it's an absolute bar to successfully suing law enforcement officers. It's not. It's actually relatively rare in the broad field of civil rights litigation in which civil cases are brought against police officers. There's a relatively small portion that actually are stopped based on qualified immunity.
Mike, you're talking about, when you talk about Terence's case, it involves policy. And are we heading toward an atmosphere in this country where police officers are just going to stand back and kind of clean up the mess, kind of be like firefighters, as opposed to being proactive, like what was happening in this case?
Well, as you heard, I've been doing this for over 40 years. And history repeats itself, I suppose, and or is cyclical. And one really hopes that we're just in a phase at this point. But I can tell you that the Department of Justice that I was part of when I was an assistant U.S. attorney is not the same today. In this particular case, all you have to do is look at the docket and see all the allegations that we brought against them for playing too close to the vest in the course of the trial. And fundamentally, this is a political case because the death of this young man occurred during the George Floyd summer. And there were 4 officers in this vehicle, and Officer Sutton happened to be the most prominent among them because he was so well known in the community and loved in the community and even respected by the criminals. And he was the subject of publicity and picketing and bonfires, and there were even 2 criminal attacks on his headquarters where incredible violence was inflicted on officers there, and windows were smashed and the like. And the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., the Department of Justice wanted a scalp. And what I can tell you is the Metropolitan Police Department officers are good officers. They're very intelligent. They're well trained. They're very concerned, they're looking over their shoulders all the time, but we had no George Floyd. And the Department of Justice was desperate to create a George Floyd in this jurisdiction, and that's what they did. And they did it by avoiding qualified immunity. How did they do that? If they tried to prosecute him under the federal crime of interfering with the civil rights of this young man, the case would be thrown out. Why? Because there was no seizure, there was no contact, there was no use of force. He caused his own death. So they charged him with second-degree murder under the DC Code and convinced the judge not to allow the type of constitutional defense that arises in every single case. Even local cases, local police officers are permitted to assert constitutional defenses against use of force claims. And that's the really dangerous part of the precedent here, is that we are no longer holding the officers accountable for their training based upon Supreme Court precedent, but they're going to have to go to the HR meetings and make sure that they understand from their policy leaders exactly what's going to happen to them if they don't take their weapon with them into the men's restroom in the district station, for example.
Again, this goes back to an atmosphere. Well, it's just an untenable atmosphere. And as people listen to this, I hope you're beginning to understand why most large metropolitan police departments are 200, 300, 400, 500 officers short or more, and why we're having such a difficult time, not just retaining experienced police officers, but also attracting new young people to the job. Jason, what do you think the end game is of this 4-year, some would argue 10-year attack on the American law enforcement officer?
Well, we've started to see some of the side effects of it. If you look city by city at its impact on police staffing, morale, crime, all of those trends taken together, and we've written about this in a number of different ways in the past several years at the LELDF. Police staffing is in crisis, and it's because they can't recruit people to become police officers for obvious reasons. That results in staffing shortages, reduction in morale in cities like, even in the District of Columbia, but in cities that perhaps I'm more familiar with, like Baltimore, their staffing in the modern era has never been this low. They have fewer than 2,000 officers now. At the high watermark in probably the early 90s, they had well over 3,000 police officers. Crime has increased, since 2015, crime has increased significantly in cities like Baltimore and Chicago that had very high profile police involved incidents, Laquan McDonald in Chicago and Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And that drove their crime up earlier than other cities. Other cities, it was a little bit later, a couple of years later, before you started to see those increases. In the District of Columbia, interestingly, for those who have doubts about the connection between police staffing and morale and increases in crime, look at the District of Columbia. They're struggling now. Other cities you're starting to see, they're still on a historic basis, they're still very high in pretty much every city, but they're down off their highs of the last several years. Not so in the District of Columbia. Crime numbers, particularly violent crime, continue to increase. And I think, you have to be really trying to manipulate the numbers, to conclude that the reason is anything other than all of this unfair scrutiny. And law enforcement is subject to fair scrutiny a lot, and that's okay. This is unfair scrutiny, unfair treatment, unfair prosecution, weaponizing the justice system, and that has resulted in what I think we've seen in terms of crime. And so what the end game is, I can't really say, but I know that so far it's had a massively deleterious effect on public safety. And that really is something everyone needs to recognize.
Mike, how do you believe law enforcement became so politicized? Because we saw this in the 60s, but by into the 80s and really through the early 90s, law enforcement wasn't so prominent in the political realm. Then in the 90s crime bill and all that, there was a little bit there, but then you fast forward now to 2024. Why is what cops do so political?
There are two reasons, in my opinion. One is the media. And we all know how it's changed so much, and we certainly expect criticism from the left regarding the media. The second, and I think it's the most important part, is a failure of those who lead our law enforcement agencies. In many instances, we're talking about political decisions about who is going to lead our law enforcement agencies. And in many circumstances, they don't pick the best leader. And they don't pick someone who develops the support, the confidence, and the courage among the officers. Once upon a time, when some dreadful offense would happen, somebody would lose their life, and officers have acted nobly, the press would get on it, of course. But the responsible leader would come out and say, I've looked at this case, and unless I learn something that's going to surprise me, what we did was perfectly appropriate to protect the people of this city, or to protect the people of this reservation, or wherever it may be. You don't see those leaders anymore, except very rarely. Most recently in Anne Arundel County, involving a pursuit.
Jason, where can folks find more about Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund and what you're doing?
Yeah, our website is policedefense.org, and there's lots of information there, not only on the officers that we are currently supporting, those we have supported in the past, as well as lots of resources on the independent research that we do on criminal justice issues like progressive prosecutors, police morale and staffing, et cetera. And all of those materials can be found on our website. And
you guys have a great social media presence too. Mike, where can people find out more about you and what you're doing?
Well, if they want to Google J. Michael Hannon, attorney, they're going to learn probably a lot more about me than I would want them to know.
Well, guys, we appreciate both of you spending time with us today. And if you'd like more information about the National Police Association, visit us at nationalpolice.org.
Are you passionate about supporting law enforcement? The National Police Association is on a mission to strengthen our communities, protect our families, and ensure justice prevails. But they need your help. Every dollar you donate makes a difference. It funds the legal defense of police officers and police agencies, supports advocacy for pro-law enforcement legislation, and funds community outreach programs and education. Imagine safer streets, stronger bonds between officers and neighborhoods, and a brighter future for all. Join us. Visit our website at nationalpolice.org to donate today.